Live. So, Robert, thanks for coming on and being willing to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
I'm a philosopher at the University of New Brunswick. I've been there, I guess, over 30 years. I better not count more than that. I'm currently the chair there. Um, my interests, well, it's a small department, so I teach a lot of different subjects, but my research interests are in the interface between religious belief and scientific thought. I have four grown children. Hobbies include chess and tennis and fishing.
You like chess too? I'm a big chess fan. I like playing the 1 minute games on like chess.com.
I can't think that fast. I have to play 15, 5, 15, 10.
Awesome. Actually, the reason I wanted to talk to you is I watched a few of your lectures on the God of the Gaps and naturalism, and I had a few questions for you about those, specifically the God of the Gaps one. You mentioned
Yeah.
that it's an argument from ignorance from your perspective, because I see it as more like an argument from incredulity of I can't understand how this could be explained naturally, therefore God kind of a thing.
Um, I take it the lecture you saw was the dig and delve one, was it?
I think so.
Yeah, okay. Um, Way back in 2002, I wrote a paper called Is There Anything Wrong with God of Gaps Reasoning? And very often in the science religion discussions, you see if an argument is labeled a God of the Gap argument, it's routinely taken as a bad argument. And I wanted to kind of analyze that because it always seemed to me that at least in principle, gap arguments could be good arguments. Um, and at that point, remarkably little had been done in analyzing exactly why it's considered a fallacy. And there is in informal logic something called the fallacy of ignorance, where if somebody argues that, suppose I say, nobody has proven that ghosts don't exist, so they must exist. That would be a standard example of the fallacy of ignorance, that because I haven't proven P, therefore not P must be true. Now, it does seem to me that gap arguments, the idea is, well, they're just wrong logically. And it seems to me that with a little bit of further investigation, they actually follow a form in logic known as modus tollens. A modus tollens says if P, then Q. So if it's true that P guarantees Q, and it's true that you don't have Q, then it's true that you don't have P. So if we know enough about something, then if we don't find evidence for it, and we know that we should, if it was really there, find evidence for it, then not finding evidence for it is a reason to think that it's not the case. So the example I gave in my paper was if my son were to tell me that there's a Great Dane in our bathroom, and I go look, and I don't see any evidence of a Great Dane, I'm rationally entitled to believe that there's no Great Dane in the bathroom. And I haven't committed the fallacy of ignorance because I know enough about reality, know enough about Great Danes, that if there was one in the bathroom, I should find evidence for it. So what goes wrong with gap arguments, if there's anything goes wrong, is if we don't know enough about how nature works. And in that case, if I were to say, well, I don't know how it works, therefore God did it, that would be an argument from ignorance and wrong. But I would argue that there are cases where we know enough about how nature works that if we observe nature exhibiting something other than what we would expect, then we're entitled to infer a non-natural cause.
Yeah, that was the most interesting part I wanted to talk about was because why would we say if we know enough about nature to conclude this is something non-natural, why would we somehow then suppose it was a supernatural thing as opposed to an unknown natural thing? Like, why wouldn't we default to the position we don't know enough about nature and come to the conclusion that it must not be natural?
I think that's the other half of the argument. We have an alternative explanatory hypothesis, namely agency. So if what we're finding that we can't explain naturalistically, but it also exhibits the marks of agency, then I think we're entitled to affirm agency. Now, we routinely affirm agency in many cases, say, when people found the Rosetta Stone, they couldn't interpret what was on it, but they inferred that the pattern on it was produced by an intelligent agent. So it does seem to me that we know enough about agency that if we find certain things in nature that it doesn't look like natural processes can produce, that if they also bear the marks of agency, that we're entitled to say they're produced by an agent.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The problem I usually have with the argument is that when you say the properties produced by an agent, that seems to be the ambiguous part of most intelligent design arguments, is that they say there is some analogous or similarity between like the origin of life and human designed objects. And that's where it seems like that doesn't seem to be the case. All of those properties like specified complexity, the information things, all of those different properties seem to not actually be borne out when discovered when explored in the fields. They find those things don't actually exist. Like specified complexity specifically was found to be a conflation between like Kolmogorov complexity and Shannon complexity, which led to like a Berry paradox or something. So it doesn't seem like there is actually a similarity that we can draw between things like DNA and human design things. That seems to be rather arbitrary to draw that connection.
Well, I guess the scientists will have to, for a lot of this, have to say. As a philosopher, what I go by is if certain facts are correct, then what inferences can be drawn from them. Now, my understanding is that DNA molecule, that it does make sense to talk about coding, about genetic codes, and if we look in our experience, the order exhibited by a code typically comes from intelligent agency. So if there is a genuine analogy between, say, the information contained in the DNA molecule and language and code, then I think my argument, I'm willing to make it. Now, if it turns out that really that analogy is a wrong one, then of course one of the premises in the argument doesn't hold water. Now, my understanding as someone who's interested but is trained in a different field is that the molecules associated with life and the structures of proteins, DNA, RNA, that they are information rich.
Oh yeah, I totally agree they are, but in most like biology and physics, pretty much everything is information rich. Like crystals are information rich.
Well, crystals have a different kind of order. They have an order that just repeats itself. You, I think, would agree that that's certainly not the type of order you find in a DNA molecule.
Right, absolutely. But that's when you're trying to make those distinctions between is there information that is somehow differentiating itself versus information in the crystal. That's where I think there's a lot of ambiguity, because in physics, information is just any kind of entropy, any kind of pattern at all counts as information. And biology kind of works in the same way. There's not like an actual kind of information that's specific to the DNA that also exists in human design things. It's just everything has information of some kind.
But we do recognize certain patterns that are produced by agents. Like, I don't want to equivocate or have too much ambiguity on the term information. Maybe you and I are understanding it somewhat differently. But if we're talking about patterns, it seems to me that certain patterns we associate with intelligence. So whether or not we're calling all patterns information, I would prefer to say that information applies to certain types of patterns that we have.
Yeah, I would have lots of questions about what exactly are the types of patterns, because I don't think that's really been well defined yet. I think that's kind of the stumbling block on intelligent design in most cases.
Well, in a crystal, the order can be explained by the nature of the material making up the crystal, and it's simply a repetitive order: A B A B A B A B. Now, in the structures of life, the order isn't inherent in the material. So, for example, there might be the same amount of mass in, say, a rabbit and a partridge. But what makes a rabbit and a partridge is the different type of information that's contained in their DNA. And it seems to me that looking at the properties of matter just in and of themselves don't get you the structure of DNA.
Yeah, I would then argue from things like the RNA on clay that we've discovered that we can actually form these kinds of shapes purely by physical systems doing this. It seems like it actually is. But I did want to get back to the God of the Gaps thing, because
and there we would have a disagreement on the empirical, whether or not your clay world scenario giving us RNA. In my understanding, there are lots and lots of difficulties with the RNA scenario.
yeah, but we do seem to be making quite a bit of progress on that. So that seems to be the right way to go, because we are making quite considerable progress on it.
I would refer you to a book, well, several books out. Foresight. There's a reissue of a book with new chapters, The Mystery of Life's Origin, where those various scenarios are looked at. You would probably know the name of James Tour.
Yep.
I mean, we have some very fine chemists and biologists who are saying, well, look, we don't have anywhere near a solution as to the origin of life.
Oh, absolutely. We don't have a solution. But I think it's a reasonable inference to say that if we can use the hypothesis that life came about from natural processes to be able to make successful testable predictions that can be confirmed in a lab, such as like RNA on clay and the making of corpuscles and all kinds of things that we see, it seems like that's a reasonable conclusion that it is, since we can use it to make testable predictions that are continually giving us knowledge.
In principle, I agree. I will just want to know, when we actually produce these things in the lab, how much intelligent intervention there's been, how much foresight we've set up in how we bring about these results. So I think you and I will probably disagree over where the empirical data is at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure that really makes much of a difference, because I think that if we can show that natural processes can form life in any means, even with partial human intervention, it seems that means it can form somewhere on its own in a universe, given the size of the universe.
Oh, I don't agree there. I can manipulate natural processes to make a cake. I don't know that if there's no intelligence in the universe that there'd be any chocolate cakes come into existence. And life is a lot more complicated than chocolate cakes. So if you're saying, well, there's been intelligent intervention and that's how we brought about these results, I'm happy to grant that natural processes are involved. What I dispute would be whether natural processes without any kind of intelligent guidance will get us what we want.
Wasn't it true that in every...
I don't want to... are we getting away from the gap arguments?
Yeah, a little bit. But yeah, so back on the gaps arguments, I agree that it's not a fallacy of validity. It's not the form is wrong. I think it's a validity, an informal fallacy where it's about soundness. And to me, it seems more like not saying that you don't know, therefore It seems more like I can't imagine, therefore. That seems to me more what a God of the Gaps actually is. It's like when we have something we don't know, I can't imagine a naturalistic solution to this, therefore the supernatural. That seems to be more analogous to what the God of the Gaps actually is. Would you disagree with that?
I would. Um, um, would you mind if I use kind of miracles as a hypothetical?
Sure.
Okay. Um, so we know we know a lot about human reproduction, and we know that at least in humans, you're not going to get a spontaneous pregnancy that will give you a male child. Is that fair?
Sure.
Yeah. So supposing the story of the virgin birth were true, just hypothetically. So that story runs that here's a young woman, and she has an experience saying you're going to become pregnant. She becomes pregnant. If we look at that story, and I realize we need to separate two questions. One, did the event occur? And two, what would be its best explanation? So in the case of a miracle, it seems to me that if we were to grant that the event occurred and the surrounding context, we would have an indication of agency.
I would not conclude that because I would look at other animals that are asexual and they can asexually reproduce and say maybe there was just a genetic mutation that caused it to happen in a woman's body. And I think that would be far more likely than a supernatural
A genetic
intervention.
mutation?
Yeah.
I think the scientists will, and you would have to explain also that the prediction was made.
Oh yeah, that
Like,
would, I
not only
think.
have a mutation, you'd have to have the prediction, and you'd have, you've granted me, just for the sake of the argument, the surrounding events. So Joseph knows that women don't become pregnant without sex. When he finds out, he's saying, well, I'm going to break the engagement. And then he has a vision, a dream that says you don't need to do this because. So you would have to not only talk about the mutation, you'd have to explain the whole teleological context, and that the probabilities there get pretty.
Oh yeah, future testable predictions I think are the best kind of evidence. So like if
Yeah.
you can predict
So-
that it would happen, that's great evidence. Or if Jesus predicted he was going to rise from the dead and then rose from the dead, that's great evidence too. So I think those would be great evidence. I just don't think
And
they
Jesus
happened.
did, in fact, we're told, predict that.
Yes, I just don't think he actually rose.
Yeah, I agree. But those are two different issues.
Yeah.
What would be the best explanation? And did the event occur? Now, in the case of miracles, typically people don't say, well, there's a natural explanation. They say the event didn't occur. Now, in the case of living things, I would say that the teleological argument and the argument for miracle is a form of the teleological argument. Usually in the teleological argument, when we talk about living things, we don't doubt the existence of living things. We doubt whether they need design to explain them. In the case of a miracle, we grant that you would need design to explain them, but the question is there good evidence they occurred?
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah. So what I would argue, and again, we will probably disagree over the empirical data, but I would argue that in the case of living things, the progress of science, the inductive argument, well, why would we think there's a future natural explanation? The inductive argument would be, well, science has been so successful in explaining things that we formerly didn't understand that we should accept its promissory note that there will be a future explanation. I think that would be the best justification of why I would accept a promissory note from the naturalist. But if increasing knowledge could make a supernatural explanation less credible, then there's a logical possibility that increasing knowledge could make it more credible.
Yep, I would agree.
So what I would argue is that when we come to things like the origin of life, actually we're in a worse situation in trying to explain it than we were when the Miller-Urey experiments were done. I think that the problem gets more and more difficult the more we know. So I think the origin of life question is actually getting further and further away from a naturalistic explanation rather than closer.
Well, that's actually why I think that the God of the Gaps is more like an argument from incredulity, because it seems to be like in that case, the evidence is saying the naturalistic explanation is getting harder, but it doesn't actually point towards any supernatural anything. Or
but that's the second half of my argument. That there's certain types of pattern that are best explained by agency. Now, also, I don't want to do all the talking here. Also, I would want to draw a distinction between what we could call nomenological science and historical science. So it does seem to me that we've been very, very successful in giving naturalistic explanations in terms of nomenological science. That is law-like regularities. Things like the origin of life, however, they're not regularly occurring events. They're historical events. And there, rather than a deductive nomenological type of explanation, we have to use abductive reasoning, typically. So the success that nomenological science has had, I would argue it doesn't automatically move over to say, well, in the realm of historical science. So if we were to go back to the hypothetical case of miracle, maybe Joseph 2,000 years ago could say, when he finds out Mary's pregnant, he might say, well, you know, I don't know much about what goes on in there. Maybe. But if the event really occurred 2,000 years on, we know a whole lot more about human reproduction, a whole lot more about human physiology. And that would make the event harder to explain. So if those events really did occur, the progress of science has made it harder to explain them as anything other than miracle. Now, when we come to say the origin of life, I would argue that the progress of science, the more we know, Darwin could think of the cell as a little blob. We now know the cell is hugely sophisticated. I mean, we're not talking simply about factory. We're talking about systems of factories. People are talking about cells having nanomachines in them. Now, if we're really content, and I think many scientists do, if we're content to talk about the cell having nanomachines, well, we know that machines don't originate without agency. So this may go back again to what we were earlier talking about, are we equivocating on what we mean by machine? But if we take that kind of talk seriously, it seems to me that machines typically involve some kind of intelligent agency.
Oh yeah, I would agree with the analogy in that sense, but again, I would take it from the perspective of, I think the predictions are the best form of evidence. So like in the case, if you could predict that someone was going to get pregnant without intercourse and it happened, that's great evidence. Or if you could predict someone's going to rise from the dead, that's great evidence. And it seems like the side making the testable predictions in the case of the origin of life are the naturalist side, where they're saying if life came about through naturalistic processes, we could expect to see the same naturalistic processes in these conditions. And then we test it and we find, yep, those conditions do have these naturalistic processes.
Um, if they're predicting and they say, well, look, under these conditions, life is likely to emerge, and those conditions don't have to make any kind of reference to intelligent agency in the setting up of the conditions, I would agree. Then Occam's razor comes into play. Um, I don't think that is the case, though.
What do you mean? Because when I've read the studies, especially on the RNA studies, that's just exactly what they say. They say if these conditions occur, and we're of course going to replicate those conditions in the lab. They're not just going to occur on their own. So we have to actually make these conditions occur. But if these conditions occur, then life will come about.
I guess what I'm looking at there is, if we go back to my analogy of baking a cake, if you're setting it up, if you're saying, well, we'll give it these conditions, and then precisely at this point, we will put in this reagent, and then a little later we'll do this, and then a little later we'll do this. That's not explicable purely in terms of natural causes without reference to agency.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. But I'd say the same
So
thing applies to every scientific discovery is that we have to, it's very hard to engineer something for the first time before we understand how it works. Like even trying to build like an electrical machine, a computer, for example. The earliest computers were hugely complicated and took up tons of electricity. But then after we got it down the first time, we could make it simpler and faster and simpler and faster. And it wasn't as difficult to do it then as it is. And I would say I'll argue the same thing is probably going to happen in the origin of life, is where we have to micromanage everything right now because we don't really understand it very well. And then as we learn more about it, we'll see, oh, there's other simpler ways to do it that we just didn't know about after we discover them.
yes, but note you're issuing me this promissory note again, and I'm going to say, if we even look at your analogy of computers, there's been a huge amount of intelligence all along the way of developing the better computer. Like simple computers, early clunky computers don't develop into more modern, sophisticated computers without intelligence being involved all the way along the line.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that on computers, but I think the same thing applies to any naturalistic discovery about how tornadoes work, how flood systems work. I was just recently watching a thing about different tidal things and how those are replicated systems and tides and how they work. And replicating those systems was really, really difficult initially. It took lots and lots and lots of very complicated maneuvering to get them to work. But then we realized, oh, we can just solve this problem, add these new features in, and it's really easy to do it now. But it seems like in
Yep.
every human discovery comes to follows that pattern of it's really hard to do and we have to micromanage everything down to the smallest detail, and then it starts getting easier.
Yes, though note again, when we're talking about tides, we're talking about regularly occurring things. The thing about tides is they happen all the time. The thing about life happening is it doesn't. And I run over a rabbit, not on purpose. They run over a rabbit on the road in the summertime. There's more than enough free energy, and you already have a huge number of the structures essential for life right there. But I don't think anybody thinks that the sun shining is going to bring about life in that mass of protein. And there we have all that stuff already made for us. So getting the first incredibly complicated cell, even the very first thing that can replicate itself, is incredibly complicated. And if we can't take a collection of cells that are already there, already sophisticated structures, and throw some energy, and we don't expect that throwing energy at it is going to bring that rabbit back to life, I think I'm entitled to a little bit of skepticism about how we got the first thing that could lead to a rabbit.
Oh, well, yeah, but I would think in the current conditions where we already have an abundance of life, especially bacteria, if any new life did actually come into existence, it would just be eaten by the other already existing bacteria. So it'd be even more difficult for life to come into existence now than it would be in the past. So I think that it's reasonable to conclude the reason we don't see life coming into existence more often is because if it did, it would just get eaten by all the bacteria everywhere.
Well, bacteria are pretty nasty doing that kind of thing. Um, uh, I just, I guess I just don't see life spontaneously arising.
So if we
Um,
discovered life on other planets, would that
experience, we never observe it.
so if we
You know,
discovered life on other planets, would that shift your weight of the evidence in some way?
um, the question then would be, would you would you have a set of natural conditions that, when we investigate, uh, would show that life plausibly arose under those conditions?
Well, would we even need to know that? Because, like in the case of the Mary getting pregnant from a future prediction, if we predict that life comes about by natural processes and we find other planets, there are life there as a prediction, wouldn't that then give us the reasonable justification to infer that it was natural processes, even though we don't know what those are yet?
Why?
The same reason that if we predict that Mary's going to get pregnant and she gets pregnant would be more evidence of a miracle because you predicted it beforehand.
Um, well, I guess theologically, I don't know that God would hesitate at making more than one world with life on it. So if I come to a world, another world with life on it, um, I guess I'm happy, both in this world and that world, to let the scientists who want to give a naturalistic explanation, to let them go to it. Um, so, and if there is a plausible naturalistic explanation that comes forward, uh, I would accept it. Like Occam's razor says, don't posit entities needlessly. What I would insist on, though, is that it's the word needlessly. It's all fine to have simple hypotheses, but the hypotheses have to actually account for all the evidence. And what concerns me is how God of the gap arguments and how methodological naturalism rule out considering alternative hypotheses.
That was the second thing I actually wanted to talk about was methodological naturalism. Why do you assume does that do you think that entails metaphysical naturalism?
Uh, no, no.
But you said it rules out other hypotheses or doesn't allow us to consider other hypotheses?
That's correct, epistemologically. So if you think of the God of the gaps argument, people who apply the God of the gaps argument and say any gap argument is illegitimate, what they're insisting is that there are no ontological gaps, that all the gaps are epistemological, that they're simply measures of our ignorance. And gaps could be measures of our ignorance, but I think there are various times when we have good reason to think they're not measures of our ignorance. In other words, the reason I would posit supernatural intervention, say in Mary's case, is precisely that I know how nature works regarding pregnancy. So if I get a different result, I have to look for a different cause. If we didn't know how dead bodies normally act, the resurrection wouldn't have any kind of significance. Now, what I worry about with methodological naturalism is that it puts in place a method that won't allow you to recognize supernatural agency even if it occurs. So if we rule out design as a possible hypothesis for the origin of life, then we're guaranteed to insist on some naturalistic hypothesis, no matter how implausible, or issue simply a promissory note. And what I want, I tell students, is just a place at the table.
I would
I think,
actually agree. I think
yeah,
it would be bad to rule out those kinds of hypotheses. And I don't think methodological naturalism does. I think it takes that. If you want to say there is a supernatural agent, all you have to do is make testable predictions. Say, if I believe there is a supernatural agent named Bob who will give me a gold brick when I pray for it, and a gold brick appears for me, methodological naturalism will say, yep, that's evidence of a supernatural being called Bob. I don't think it rules out those hypotheses. I think what it rules out is just using post hoc analysis to try and come to those conclusions without actual some kind of future testable demonstration.
well, an example, I'm sure you're aware of it, is intelligent design people made predictions that there would be far less junk DNA than people were saying. So that was a prediction. Um, Now, I think we can recognize agency without predictions. Um, you and I are talking here, recognizing agency without making predictions about what the other person will just say the next minute or so. So I don't think you have to have, and I can make a prediction, only it's hard to prove a negative. I'm making a prediction that people aren't going to be successful in providing plausible naturalistic accounts for the origin of life. That's a prediction. If it's falsified, then I was wrong. But if you think that falsifiability guarantees scientific status, then I've made a scientific prediction. Now, I think there are problems with falsifiability being the hallmark of science. It's one of the elements of science, but I am making a prediction. And I'm also presenting evidence. I'm saying, well, look, the progress of science has made providing an inductive justification of the naturalist issuing a promissory note, that the inductive argument goes the other way, that the more we find out about life, the harder it will be to give naturalistic explanations.
Oh yeah,
So, yeah, I think those are predictions that can be tested. Well, the one about the progress of science can certainly be tested.
oh definitely. But I think the same prediction was made by the scientists. Like when they said that DNA was going to be junk DNA. I mean, it is because, but what they mean by that isn't that it has no function. It doesn't have a specific evolutionary functions of the kind they were talking about. They never said it had no function. So that wasn't ever a contradiction. That was the same prediction being made by both the creationists and the evolutionary biologists. So that wasn't like a unique prediction to intelligent design.
It's interesting, though. Francis Collins, who is a theistic evolutionist, early on in his book, The Language of God, he actually gave this as evidence for evolution, the amount of junk DNA, and he's backed off from that. So the ENCODE project has, routinely junk DNA was given as a firm evidence in favor of evolution, and people have said, well, no, it's not quite that. It's not quite that easily the case of it being evidence.
Yeah, I'm really familiar with the ENCODE project, but that was never inconsistent with anything that the evolutionism, the naturalistic evolutionist ever said, because the function they're referring to is a specific kind of evolutionary function, which the DNA doesn't have. They still agree that 80% of the DNA does not have that function that they said it didn't have. The ENCODE project was measuring simply the connection of the proteins where they bonded with the DNA, and that was it. It's just anything that does that has a function. And well yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I presume it's far less junk than what was being said.
I don't think so. I think that, again, by junk, they specifically mean there is this one particular evolutionary function that does not exist, and anything that doesn't have that evolutionary function, we're going to refer to as junk. And that percentage it's remained the same the entire time. It's still like 80%. They've always said it's about 80%. It's still like 80%.
I think we're reading different people.
I'm pretty sure we are. I think we're just using the term junk differently. I think that's the difference, because nothing in the ENCODE project ever changed any of the consensus in biology about the amount of junk DNA. It's still the exact same. It was always the exact same at 80%. The only thing they said was that what they were referring to as a function is different, in that in that experiment than what is normally referred to as a function in evolutionary biology. Like if you just go into any scientific paper right now, modern day publications, they're still going to say the junk DNA or the, I think they use non-coding as the new term to try and clarify it. Non-coding DNA is still at like 80%.
Are you concerned that we're equivocating on the word junk?
Yes, I think that's the problem. The main criticism of the ENCODE project is that it's equivocating the term function and junk. Those two terms are equivocated to mean two different things.
Yeah, I'm aware that Larry Moran wants to say stuff like that, but I'm also aware that there are other biologists that are disagree with that. So I think there's a deeper issue there that we'd have to have a much longer conversation to get at.
To simplify it a bit, would you say that if the consensus among biologists was that that went one way or the other, that would be solve the issue? That would be good evidence to conclude one way or the other?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
If the majority of biologists or biochemists used the words in that one way more often, would that be sufficient reason to conclude that he's actually right, that there is an equivocation between these two ways in the way the ENCODE project is using it?
Here I want to be careful. Consensus, in some cases, I take seriously. In other cases, I worry about consensus. It does seem to me that the ENCODE project did overturn a number of convictions that people had. So I guess what I would say is I do want to take the expert's view seriously. I am concerned that many times, well, there is in science in philosophy of science, what's known as the demarcation problem.
Yep, I love that one, the separation between science and pseudoscience.
And it's very, very difficult to make a nice sharp boundary between science and non-science. And you're probably familiar with Larry Lauden's article, Demise of the Demarcation Problem. I tend to agree with him that I'd like to drop the term pseudoscience and talk about bad science and good science.
Do you think there's a difference between the term pseudoscience and bad science?
Well, pseudoscience somehow says it's not really scientific thinking. And I guess what I want to claim, I was once giving a talk about William Dembski, and I made the remark and he liked it. I said, William Dembski may be wrong, but he's not necessarily wrong-headed. So I think there's a difference between being wrong about something and just being wrong-headed. And when you talk about pseudoscience, it's the suggestion that these people are just wrong-headed. They're just living in Never Never Land. I think when we say bad science, we say, well, these people are trying to be scientific, but they're not doing a good enough job at it.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I think that's a good distinction to make. I don't think we should ever say people are wrong-headed. I think the only value of the distinction between science and pseudoscience is to distinguish between methodologies we have shown work versus methodologies we've shown don't usually work. And if you're using one of the methodologies we know really don't work, that is what I would just call pseudoscience. I wouldn't call it necessarily wrong-headed. It's just we know that methodology doesn't work for some reason.
Yeah. Well, here, if we can bring the discussion back to methodological naturalism, I would like to, many people I think are trying to use that as the latest demarcation. What demarcates science from non-science is that science is committed to natural explanations. And there are a number of reasons I don't like that. One is the distinction that I want to draw between historical and nomenological science. Two, it seems to me that the reason we accept natural explanations when we do is not because we have a method that said you have to give natural explanations. It's that they satisfy other virtues of explanation, things like Occam's razor, consilience, simplicity, non-ad hocness.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of talking about methodological naturalism, let's talk about satisfying these other virtues. So I've said to you, if somebody can give me a naturalistic explanation of, say, the origin of life, and they can show how you would have these conditions plausibly without intelligent intervention, I'm going to accept it. What I don't want is to be constrained by a method that says you can't consider any other hypothesis.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, but I would say that methodological naturalism is essentially saying it's always preferable to use a hypothesis that is comprised of things that have already been verified, as opposed to add in something new that hasn't been verified. And since we only have verified evidence of natural things, as far as we know, it's usually always a better hypothesis to just combine those things in new ways to come up with an explanation than to add in something new like a supernatural or a non-natural thing.
I guess my response is I think you're begging a lot of questions there.
How so?
Well, I understand just looking at your web page, you don't think there's any epistemic evidence for God at all.
Yes, pretty much. That's the claim. Yep.
Yeah. So you don't think there's any evidence at all. I think there's considerable evidence. So for example, I think that our best cosmology gets us to a universe that comes into existence.
Yep, I agree. Big Bang. Yep.
Big Bang. Now, I think either then you have to say you can get something from nothing, or you posit some kind of alternative cause that's non-material. And the big guy's waiting in the wings if you do that. When we come to the origin development of life.
Well, actually, look, can I just pick up on that one, the cosmological one? So, for example, would it be better to take a hypothesis that is a combination of natural properties that we know exist to explain that than to add in a God? Wouldn't it be, if we can do it, if we can make up a explanation of the origin of the universe that's timeless and spaceless, with only appealing to things we know about in the universe, naturalistic things, wouldn't that hypothesis therefore be preferred to a supernatural hypothesis? Because that would be Occam's razor. You're adding in entities unnecessarily.
I think our cosmology says that all those natural things came into existence, that we at one point they started to be. So if you're going to explain them, you can't appeal to them.
Well, so hypothetically, if we could come up with a just using combinations of things we know in physics to create a model that can explain the origin of the Big Bang without appeal to the supernatural, would that be hypothetically simpler than a supernatural hypothesis?
Yes.
Because so then
if there's no origin of the universe, then my appeal to the Callum cosmological argument goes away. So that's an empirical premise. And I'm saying our best cosmology suggests this absolute beginning. So as a naturalist, if somebody wants to say, well, that's not the case, we can go to the science and talk about the scientists. It's interesting. I know a fellow, he's a process guy, process theology. You're familiar?
Yep.
So he's a panentheist. He doesn't like that. And I say to him, well, look, how does process fit with an absolute beginning of the universe? And he says to me, well, we haven't actually proven it had an absolute beginning. And I say to him, well, but doesn't our best science go there? So we have this cosmology.
Well, that's the point I wanted to make real quick. So we actually do have those. We do have theories that do explain the origin of the universe made up purely of naturalistic things. For example, there's Sean Carroll's emergent spacetime and Nima Arkani-Hamad's amplituhedron. We do actually have that. And the reason is because the term beginning of the universe doesn't mean beginning of all things. We're conflating the term universe with cosmos, essentially. In physics, the universe is just all the stuff we can measure. It doesn't entail everything. And so the beginning of our universe is not the beginning of all things. And space-time is a physical thing. It's not a physical philosophical principle that applies to all reality. And so when our space-time had a beginning, that says nothing about what came before it. So in physics, the Big Bang doesn't at all say there's an absolute beginning. It just says there's an absolute beginning to our subjective universe and tells us nothing about what came before it.
But neither is it entitled to say that there was something material before that.
Oh, well, sure, there could always be different things, but the evidence in physics doesn't indicate that.
Be God, because it seems it's going to have to be non-material, what we're talking about.
No, that's the part that isn't necessarily true, because when it says the universe had a beginning, it only means our universe, our space-time, our material. It doesn't say all material. That's not a conclusion of the Big Bang. It's only ours.
I think people like Carroll are equivocating on the word nothing.
Krauss, yeah, Carroll doesn't do that. Krauss.
So, but maybe I can put it this way. You and I can disagree, but there's evidence. Like there is a discussion to be had. Similarly, there's a discussion to be had about the origin of life. Similarly, there's a discussion to be had about consciousness. So you have materialists talking about the hard problem of consciousness. You have Kim's exclusion problem. So I think there's considerable evidence, and I'm willing to talk about it. And we can debate on its evidential status. But I think how to put it this way, I don't think it's surprising that you and I would disagree on this issue of whether there's any evidence for God. Also, given the work I've done on miracle, the actual historical investigation, for example, at the time of Laplace, there were peasants that reported that stones fell out of the sky. And Laplace and his fellow astronomers refused to believe them because they were ignorant peasants. And there was no room in their theory for stones falling out of the sky. So I want to distinguish the question of do certain events occur and what is their explanation? And I think in treating miracle, if I can go to an area that I've worked in quite a bit, in treating miracle, I think very often the claim is simply made without any kind of detailed investigation that we know these events can't occur.
Oh, yeah, I would reject that. That you should never say that. You should never rule out the possibility that things could occur. I would always object to the second one, is why would we conclude that's a miracle? I would always say it's always better to prefer things that are combinations of known verified principles as opposed to adding in a non-verified thing.
So if Jesus did predict that he would rise from the dead, if you were persuaded of that as a historical event.
Yeah, that's evidence. That's if Jesus predicted he would rise from the dead and he rose from the dead, that's evidence. If you do that today, I'm like, yep, that's evidence of the supernatural.
Say there's evidence.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
So if you give novel testable predictions like that, I count it as evidence. The reason I say there is none is because I don't think there are any like that.
Well, let me give you a miracle case that I've actually researched, if that's okay.
Sure.
I've realized we're moving around quite a large area.
It's a great, interesting conversation, so it's totally fine.
There's a woman in our church, and everybody in the church knows her. I didn't see this miracle, but I interviewed her. And as a young woman, she had some medical issues in her 20s. And these issues, the doctors didn't quite know what to do. At one point, they took out a vertebrae. A lot of things tried, didn't work. They eventually, and she seemed to get better. And then in her 30s, this stuff started to reoccur. And they sent her to Montreal. I live in the Maritimes. At that time, that wouldn't have the same sophisticated hospitals as Montreal would have. They sent her to Montreal, and she was diagnosed with MS. She came home, had to go back in a year or two time, And at that point, they said to her, well, look, this was previously more slow moving, but now it's going to be pretty fast moving. You're going to die from this fairly shortly. She came home, and she had, at first, she could do a little bit with a walker, but she soon was confined to bed. At night, she'd have to be on the floor because of the pain and the spasms and cramps and stuff. Her husband would have to turn her, and she was getting worse and worse. And she reached a point where they were saying to her, we think you should go into the hospital. You're dying, and we can make your last few weeks less painful. And she'd been very worried about her daughter, what happened to her teenage daughter if she died. But she was praying that afternoon, and she had a friend phone her, and the friend said, I think God told me that he's going to heal you. And she said to her friend, well, I do believe in healing, but I don't think so. I've been prayed for many times. I don't think this is going to happen. And she was praying that afternoon, and she said to me that she felt a real peace. And basically what she said to God in her prayer was, if I'm a little bit better tomorrow, I'll take that as a sign. But if I'm not, I'm willing to go to the hospital. And that night she had a dream she's going to be healed. This was a Friday. Saturday she spent in bed. And she said to her husband, she said, I want to go to church on Sunday. She hadn't been to church for a long time because she was just too sick. So Sunday comes, and they carry her in a chair. She can't go in on her own power. And she told me that as she was going up the aisle, she felt this inner voice say to her, in a minute of time, you'll know my power. So she gets to the front of the church. The minister had had no experience ever having a person be healed, but he prayed for her, and she was instantaneously healed. Walked out of the church on her own power, never any recurrence of MS. You can imagine how much muscle atrophy there would have been. She went back, did housework that afternoon. Excuse me. Now, there are many, many people in the church congregation that actually know her, knew the situation, and say to me, yes, indeed, that event took place. Okay, so now I've got my two questions. One, did the event occur?
Yeah, I'd say yes, I'm sure.
And two, what's its best explanation?
I would again go with natural there, because I would say that,
Yes, I realize you will.
because from my perspective, it's what you mentioned earlier is someone said she was going to pray for her, her response was, well, I don't think that's going to work because lots of people have prayed for me before in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like the prayer doesn't seem to be the factor that made a difference there. It just seemed to be like more likely that the prayer happened and something else caused her to be healed. So to infer that the prayer was actually the cause of the healing, you'd need something more, since we know how often prayers work and how often they don't, or how often they don't work, that it seems unreasonable to come to the conclusion that it was the prayer that caused the healing in that case, because we know how often it doesn't work. And when we do the studies on healing and intercessory prayer, they all come out with negative results every time we do them. So to conclude that it was prayer based off of that, I don't think is a reasonable inference. But I do think the healing is miraculous in that sense, and we should definitely take it as a real account and try and figure out what did cause it. But those kinds of things happen all over the world. There are unexplained healings that happen everywhere of really miraculous kinds in all cultures, regardless of prayer. And because of that, I think that it's unreasonable to conclude that it was the prayer that caused it, or that it was specifically a miracle by God, as opposed to just something natural that we don't know about yet.
Well, what I would say here, though, is remember we were talking about predictions, and I'm taking her word that she heard this inner voice. But notice what she's getting is not simply, I happened to go up to the front of the church and then something spontaneous happened. she has this inner voice that says, in a minute of time, you're going to know my power. And it was interesting because when I was interviewing her, I said, well, and this goes back to your many times people are prayed for and healing doesn't take place. But I said to her, well, why would God heal you at that time in your life and not earlier? And what she said to me, she said, if I had the choice between being healed earlier in life and not having the experience of that voice, and having to wait and have the experience of that voice, I would wait. It was that powerful to her. So I would agree with you. Well, a couple comments. One, notice that you've given me your explanation, and I would be inclined to say, well, you're issuing me a promissory note. And to me, you're inclined to say, well, why doesn't this happen with a regularity of law? Why can't we? Why, if people pray, don't they always get healed?
Well, no, not exactly. So my argument would be more that if prayer worked, then we would see that people who were prayed for would be healed more often than people who weren't prayed for, or people who were prayed for to a different God or something. But we don't see that. We see the exact same amount of healings across all spectrums.
Well, a comment there. Don't take me as saying that miracles only happen in Christianity. I don't claim that. I'm quite happy. I think that was a mistake that some of the reformers made. Catholics said to the Protestants, well, where are your miracles to prove? And the Protestant says, well, you just have fake miracles. I think that seeing miracles simply as some kind of epistemological guarantee of God's existence is mistaken. I think it does function that way, but I would say that more fundamentally, it functions as a response to need or evil. So I take the New Testament seriously. When Jesus fed the 5,000, you had these bunch of people that followed him out into the wilderness, kind of like a rock concert in a way. And they've been there and they're hungry and they're going to faint on the way back. And Jesus says, okay, we're going to have to feed these guys. What he didn't say was, everybody that thinks I'm the Messiah, you get fed, the other guys go home. So I think miracles, to the degree that they occur, are more a response to need than a guarantee of doctrine. If that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah, sure. I can accept that, but I would still have the question that it seems like if we grant miracles occur, they seem to occur at exactly the same probability of random chance across cultures everywhere in the world, which seems rather strange. Like it's not really an intentionality kind of a thing, more like a random occurrence.
I guess I would want to ask how much detailed investigation you've done there.
Well, me personally, none. I'm just going off of the studies. All the studies have been done on intercessory prayer and spontaneous healings across the world come up with the results that, they all get this. They always have this. Are you
familiar with Craig Keener's 2-volume book, Miracle?
The 1,000-page book weight.
Yes. He's one of those scholars that most of his text is footnotes, it seems. But he mentions there that more than 600 million people in the world claim either to have experienced or witnessed firsthand what they take to be divine healing. Now, that's a pretty enormous number. And I think very often, well, let me give you an example. I don't know if you know John Ehrman. He wrote a book called, Hume. It was on Hume and how bad the essay was.
Yep, I recall it, yeah. Deconstruction of Hume or something. Yes.
But at one point, Ehrman says, well, Hume's arguments aren't very good, but I agree with them. And he says, well, look, anybody that believes in miracles, it's like believing in a UFO. Well, I actually thought I would do some research on that. Miracles have been recorded throughout history. It's interesting with UFOs. First reports of UFOs came in the late 1940s. So there is quite a bit of difference between reports of UFOs, their history, and the history of reports of miracles.
What difference just in the time frame?
Well, in the time frame and how they are reported. So unidentified flying objects, we got a real surgence of them in the 1940s, which is pretty easily explained. But if we were treating them as analogous to miracles, presumably we'd have these reports going back, the same kind of time period as miracles. We don't have that. And I haven't done this exhaustively, but I have looked at it fairly seriously. The easy claim that reports of miracles, or of events that I'm calling miracles, okay, that reports of these events are on the same evidential basis as reports of UFOs, I don't think it stands up to empirical scrutiny from what I've been able to dig into. Now, when I call these events miracles, I do want to distinguish those two questions. I mean, in principle, a really hardcore naturalist could say, okay, Jesus came back to life. Why bring God into it? Maybe really strange, spontaneous things happen. I mean, if you really want to go there, I guess what I'm going to say to that person is I'm going to say, well, okay, if you want to give a naturalistic explanation of the resurrection, go ahead. Remembering that we distinguish these two events. You've granted that it occurred. Your issue is giving it a naturalistic explanation. Go ahead. Let's see how you do. And if you come up with a really good one, Occam's razor, okay. I would say the same thing about the origin of life. It's just that given that we know that agents routinely produce events that nature would not otherwise produce, I also want that hypothesis, that naturalistic hypothesis, in competition with my hypothesis.
Yeah, so the way I would address it, I would say is like if Bob down the street rose from the dead, I would say we would be unreasonable to conclude anything about the supernatural. Like it's probably an unknown natural event we haven't discovered yet. I would say that because everything we've discovered in the past has always been natural, and here is some event we can't explain. It's probably reasonable to conclude it's going to be natural in some sense. We have no idea how. I'm not going to provide any type of explanation. I have no idea how it happened, but I would say it would be unreasonable to conclude it was supernatural. Now, if you made a testable prediction, like I am going to die and rise from the dead in 3 days because of a supernatural agent called God, and that occurred, that would be great evidence for God. But I would say the same thing for naturalism. If I said, there's this naturalistic particle called the wiggly boggly particle, and I'm going to die, and this particle is going to rise me from the dead, then I'd say that's a good explanation of the natural particle too.
So I have real hope for you here, Tom, because if I can persuade you of the historicity of the New Testament, you're.
If you persuade me Jesus rose from the dead and Jesus claimed that he was going to rise from the dead, that's great evidence. I would definitely grant that.
Yeah. Just to press you a little bit, I think for the naturalist, they're going to have to explain things in terms of either chance or necessity, ultimately. Now, often people will say, well, maybe there are these unknown laws. But I think it's a mistake to appeal to law in the sense of a general regularity when you're attempting to explain events which by their very nature stand apart from regularity. So when we come, say, to the origin of life, life does not regularly come into existence. So somebody's saying, well, maybe there's this unknown law. I'm inclined to say, well, really, you're going to have to appeal to chance. Now, what I'm urging in
Well,
response,
are you offering like, is the God hypothesis not ultimately determined by chance or necessity? Is that what you're arguing, that there's a third option there?
I'm arguing for a third option, agency. I'm arguing that we experience ourselves as agents. We experience ourselves producing in nature things that nature would not otherwise produce. So, if I come to a skyscraper, I say there was intelligent agency there.
But you're saying agency would not be ultimately determined by chance or necessity.
That's right. So, I mean, this will go ultimately to the mind-body problem too.
So the free will kind of a thing where there's this third category.
Yeah. So, you as a naturalist, I think ultimately you're going to have to explain agency somehow in terms of chance or necessity.
Mm-hmm.
And this, of course, is what the theory of evolution does. It says, well, we can recognize human agency as a stopgap explanation for certain things, because ultimately we have this origin story that can explain human agency without agency being fundamental. And we routinely do this, the Rosetta Stone, skyscrapers, etc. It's only when we come to things in nature that we don't have a nice explanation in terms of human agency that we say, oh, no, we could not explain design. We could not invoke design. We routinely invoke design if we're going to talk about the Empire State Building. Life is a lot more complicated and structurally complex than the Empire State Building, but the naturalist says, oh, no, you can't appeal to design there. And I'm going to say, well, you haven't shown me the reduction of human agency. You've just said that's part of my story.
What do you mean reduction of human agency?
Well, for the naturalist, consciousness is a latecomer to the scene. That it will be explained in terms of non-consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying, well, we haven't actually done that. There are lots of things in the world that we routinely explain in terms of human consciousness. The archaeologist, the anthropologist that says, well, to my trained eye, this is in fact an arrowhead. Well, if life is analogous in its structure to our very, very complicated machines or factories or systems of factories, then I'm going to say, okay, why can't I appeal to agency? And if the naturalist says, well, you can't, because we can ultimately explain agency, I'm going to say, no, you haven't done that. You've issued me this story. And I take agency very seriously. So ultimately, when I'm arguing for God, I'm arguing, well, we have experience of what it is to be an agent. When we talk about God, we take that positive knowledge of what it is to be an agent and we negate limitations on it. In various ways, what I argue for is, well, doesn't it make sense to take agency seriously? And if we do take agency seriously, certain things that we look at, especially questions of origin, are best explained. So it's an abductive argument that I'm making.
Yeah, so my response would be like in the case of the Rosetta Stone, it's like if we see a hoof print in the ground, it's reasonable to infer it was a horse, but it's not reasonable to infer it was a unicorn. So I would say the same thing is that if we see something complicated and we know of a natural thing that can explain it with agency, then it's reasonable to infer it was done by agency. But if you're inferring this new kind of agency that we haven't discovered yet, it would be kind of like inferring that there was a unicorn that caused the hoof print. So I think it's reasonable to infer the Rosetta Stone was designed by human agents because we have examples of humans currently today. Or like if I told you I saw a dog, that would be reasonable to believe. But if I told you I saw a unicorn, that wouldn't be reasonable to believe because you're asserting this new kind of a thing. So in the case of the design hypothesis, I think it's reasonable to infer design when you're only adding in things that we already have a verified basis for. But when you add in that new thing, that's when it becomes unreasonable. Like if we discover like a handprint on Mars, or walking like footprints on Mars or something. We wouldn't infer there's probably aliens. We'd probably infer that's probably caused by a natural thing that we just don't understand yet.
Oh, really? Um, so supposing, and I mean, we're getting pretty far with thought experiments here, but supposing, well, let me set it up a little bit so it won't seem quite as far out. When I got your email a few weeks ago, I inferred intelligence. But I had at that point no idea of what you look like. You might even have been a woman calling herself Tom. I don't know how tall you are. I don't know whether you wear glasses. I don't know whether you're bald. But I do know that there's an intelligence producing it. So suppose we explore the whole universe. And let's say we know that we are the only physical, intelligent beings in the universe. Let's say we've established that.
Okay.
But let's say we find a certain pattern on a faraway planet that we know nobody has ever visited before us. And we find that it's a complicated mathematical proof. I would infer agency. Okay.
Okay.
Now, and I've set it up, and I realize this at a practical level, we're not going to do this, but I would infer agency. I might first say, oh, were there aliens? But we've gotten that rid of. But if it was aliens, I wouldn't know what they were like. Are they carbon-based? I don't know. But I know they're intelligent. Well, if we find this mathematical equation or this mathematical proof, and we say we know every physical intelligent being in the universe, and we know they didn't produce it, I'm still going to say there's an intelligent cause there. Now, there would be an awful lot for me to fill in, but I would infer intelligence. And that's, you can see where I'm going with this.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, I totally agree with that reasoning. But I'd say the first problem is if you could rule out all the other possible alternatives first, yeah, then sure, of course, that makes perfect sense.
To your handprint example.
What?
You know, if we go to Jupiter and we find that equation, we're pretty sure we haven't been there, but we would probably take that as evidence of intelligence.
Yeah, I would agree.
We would want to look, we say, okay, well, it must be some alien physical form of intelligence. But in principle, we're more sure, well, not in principle, we're more sure that it was produced by intelligence than we are of it being produced by a physical intelligence.
Right. I would agree. And I would say that if we saw that in DNA, if we actually saw like a mathematical code there that was like literally written out in the structure of DNA, I would conclude that was also designed probably as well.
Yeah, and that will go to probably our disagreements about whether coding and stuff. But I realize there are people who say, well, you know, look, that's all just metaphor. But I think many scientists take very seriously when they're talking about it being code, when they're talking about it being literally language, that's what they mean. So I think there are very strong analogies between machines and biological entities. I think there are very strong resemblances between the structure of the DNA and information, actual language-bearing things. So, you know,
oh yeah, I would grant the code analogy. I definitely consider DNA to be a code, but I think it's a physical code. I don't think that codes are only intrinsic to humans or intelligence.
But I guess if I go back to the patterns, when I see a certain pattern of letters in a book, I infer intelligence because although there's ink and paper and physical properties involved, the physical properties of the ink and paper are not such that they will produce that structure. And then we need a cause that will explain it. And typically that's intelligence. And I would say that's the same case. That's the same is true of DNA, that the structure of the DNA doesn't seem, in fact, it couldn't be, because if it were just like a crystal, If it couldn't be, if it was totally the inherent properties of the thing, then you couldn't write on it. Like if you want to have students make fun of me when I talk of CDs, they say, "Look, that's ancient technology." But okay, I'm old. A CD, when you burn something on it, it has to be of such and such a surface that you can actually change the surface.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it has to be that the inherent material that is making up the CD is such that it will take on a certain pattern, and the pattern is not inherent in that structure. And I would say the same thing about the pattern that we find in DNA.
That it has the ability to be changed?
No, that the components making it up don't, their properties don't explain how the structure came into being.
Oh yeah, I would totally agree with that, but I can say the same thing about, like, for example, a stone arch. Like you have a stone arch that are purely naturally made, but none of the properties in it explain how it was made. It was actually the water that made it, and it was just bore out the rocks underneath it, and now the water's gone. So I'd
But
say that
I'm going to say that there are the patterns that water will produce acting on rock are very different than the kind of patterns you find in DNA.
oh right, that's the part where we disagree. I think the patterns in DNA are there is no specific kind of agency pattern found in DNA. I think it's purely just natural patterns, the same as any other pattern. I don't think that thing is a real property. It seems like to me like there's a vague analogy saying there is this property in DNA which is also found in agent designed things, and I think there is no concrete definition of that property that I could accept.
I would say, well, maybe we've just reached a point where we have to agree to disagree. I would say DNA is like a building. The structure of the building cannot be explained in terms of the properties of the components of the building.
Yeah, I don't know
There's
exactly what that means.
structure imposed on those materials.
Wouldn't that be true of anything, any kind of structure? The parts in it wouldn't necessarily explain the origin of the structure. Like even in the crystal, the particular organization of the chemical bonds in the crystal don't necessarily determine the shape of the crystal. There's lots of different kinds of crystals that we have, of all kinds of shapes.
In the case of a building, we need intelligence to get that structure.
But we already know that because we design buildings. But
in the case of the crystal, we can explain it in terms of the inherent properties making it up. As long as there's new material incoming, the inherent properties explain what the structure will be like.
Sure, but they don't like determine it in that sense. But if we take it to like a new object we don't know of yet, like a tesseract, if we discovered a tesseract, like an actual 4D box or something, like we wouldn't be able to conclude that was designed based off of the shape, because the shape doesn't necessarily determine why it's that shape. We wouldn't be able to.
If we go to Jupiter and we find, is the Space Needle in Seattle?
Yeah, I think so.
If we find the exact same shape as the Space Needle in Seattle, I think we could conclude intelligent agency.
Oh, I totally agree, because I think there is definitely a similarity between the Space Needle in Seattle and the Space Needle in Jupiter. The difference, I think, is that I don't think there is an analogy between DNA and human-designed things or agent-designed things. I don't think there is a property they share in that same sense.
And I guess we've reached a point where we're going to have to say we're at loggerheads.
Yep.
I think DNA is like a computer. I think it's got information in it. And I think you have to account for that information. And I don't think that chance and necessity does it.
Well, yeah, we've gone for a little bit over an hour. This has been a really interesting conversation. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed this, and I enjoy exchanging ideas with an intelligent opponent who can make me actually justify all the things that I want to say.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm gonna get some food. I hope you have a really nice rest of your day.
Yeah, and stay well, Tom.
You too. Talk to you later.
Yeah. Bye.